and welcome to IndiTalk. This is a show on which we discuss controversial subjects of national importance. And today's subject is the crisis in Sri Lanka, where President Sri Sena has declared an emergency. Now, this is really unfortunate, particularly for me at a personal level, because I've followed the events in Sri Lanka very closely, right since 1986, 1987. Right from the time of the rise of the LTTE to their virtual capture of the North to the end of the LTTE in November 2009, when the President of Sri Lanka destroyed the LTTE, which was basically a fascist, a terrorist organization which wanted a separate state and then maybe a much larger state that possibly had hopes of designs of allying, of becoming one with the state of Tamil Nadu, led by a man called Prabhakaran. And it was Mahinda Rajapakse, the president of Sri Lanka, who was able to beat Prabhakaran, a war in which more than 80 or 90,000 people had died, the civil war. It was virtually a civil war. And peace finally, we thought, had come back to Sri Lanka in 2009, 2010. There were abuses of human rights on both sides, and in fact, Sri Lankan government itself was condemned several times in the United Nations Human Rights Commission, in which India joined in the anti-Sri Lanka vote sponsored by the United States, in saying that Tamils, despite the defeat of the LTTE, were being treated like second-class citizens, and that the Sri Lankan government wasn't moving fast enough to take care of this problem, and that human rights in Sri Lanka and resettlement of displaced Tamils and refugees, there were more than 300,000 of them at one time, and who have now, most of them, been resettled, was a terrible humanitarian crisis that had enveloped Sri Lanka. Well, things began to calm down, and the great champion of the Sinhala people, Mahinda Rajapakse, who was at the helm of affairs when the war against the LTTE was won, was actually defeated in an election, went into exile. Well, not into exile, but went so-called into the wilderness, and Sri Sena and Wickramasinghe took power. Just as Sri Lanka had begun to settle down, and Sri Lanka, for most parts of it, except for these horrible terrorist attacks that used to take place when LTT was at the height of its powers, is a peace-loving and peaceful nation of very, very gentle people. They are an extremely peace-loving, extremely gentle people, and they are a mixed community. About 75 or so percent of them are Buddhists. Another 9% or more are actually Muslims. Then about 12%, that's the second largest community, are Hindus. And then there is a Christian minority of about 6.5% to 7%. But most of them have lived in peace, except for clashes between the Sinhala, who are mostly Buddhist, and of course the Tamils in the north, mostly in the north. And there was a period when the Muslims were mistreated by the LTTE, and there was an ethnic cleansing that went on, in which most of the Muslims from the north in Jaffna were actually driven east towards Trincomalee and towards Kirinochi. And just as peace was returning there, it seems that militant Buddhism seems to be on the rise again, and perhaps being taken advantage of by the party of Rajapakse, which has been in the wilderness for these last 2 or 3 years. And Buddhist militarism has been actually on the rise in places like Malaysia, and as well as in Myanmar, and has also caught the fancy, it seems, of Buddhists in Sri Lanka, where it has taken on basically an anti-Muslim coloration. Now this is sad because Sri Lanka is a country only of about 20 million people. That's not much. It's about the size of Delhi, and of those 20 million, if you have 9.5–10% Muslims, that's a very large number of Muslims. And these Muslims have mostly not been influenced by a hardcore Wahhabi or Sunni philosophy. They have lived mostly in peace and have not been easily swayed by groups which have been able to sway some of the more militant elements in Kashmir, and which owe their existence to militant Islam of the Arabized world. The fear is that if Muslims in Sri Lanka feel unprotected by the government, and the government takes a short-sighted view of this and feels that for political gain, just to come back into power, it will support majoritarian Buddhist violence against Muslims, the country, which has just come out of a terrible civil war, could once again fall into the hands of a small number of extremists and be held to ransom again just when its economy is rising, tourism is rising, and the country is on the road to peace and prosperity. That's all for today on IndiTalk. This is Indrajit Badwar. I'll be back again with more burning issues. Catch us.